He laughed at the poor kid, kicking his worn-out toolbox. 15 minutes. Make this scrap heap run, and I'll give you the deed to this $100 million land. If not, you get on your knees and clean my shoes. The billionaire thought it was a joke. He thought he was humiliated, a nobody on live stream. He didn't know the machine was just sleeping, waiting for the one person who could hear its heartbeat. And when that boy touched the cold metal, the billionaire's smile vanished forever. The air inside the abandoned ironworks plant in Detroit didn't smell like decay. It smelled like waiting. It was a heavy, industrial scent of stale oil, cold steel, and 50 years of silence, all trapped beneath a glass ceiling that hadn't seen a window washer since the Reagan administration. Dust motes danced in the shafts of afternoon sunlight that pierced the gloom, settling on the skeletons of unfinished assembly lines like snow on a battlefield. But today, that silence was being murdered. Marcus Sterling strode through the center aisle of the factory floor, his Italian loafers clicking sharply against the concrete. He looked like a diamond dropped in a coal chute. His bespoke Navy suit cost more than the pension funds of the men who used to work here. And he moved with the aggressive, shark-like energy of a man who measured time in stock ticks. Hovering around him was a cloud of assistants and a camera crew, their LED ring lights cutting through the factory's dignified shadows with a harsh, surgical glare. "Cut the feed for a second," Sterling snapped, pulling a silk handkerchief from his pocket to wipe a microscopic speck of soot from his lapel. "This place is filthy. Are we sure the Wi-Fi signal is strong enough back here? I don't want to lag when I announce the demolition." "Signal is 5 bars, Mr. Sterling," a nervous production assistant chirped. "We're live to 3 million people in 10 seconds. Sterling transformed instantly. His scowl vanished, replaced by a practiced, blinding smile that didn't reach his eyes. He slicked back his silver hair and turned to the camera lens as if it were a lover. "Welcome back, guys," Sterling boomed, his voice echoing off the corrugated iron walls. "I'm standing right here in the belly of the beast, the old world. Look at this." He swept his arm grandly toward the rows of rusted hydraulic presses. "Some people call this history. I call it dead weight. We are standing on the future site of the Sterling AI data center. Out with the rust, in with the cloud." He walked briskly toward the back of the facility, known as Area 9. This was where the heavy lifting used to happen, where the legendary engines were born. Now, it was just a dark corner piled high with tarps and trash. "Today, we're doing a little spring cleaning," Sterling narrated to the camera, stepping over a pile of discarded gears. "Anything that doesn't start, doesn't stay. If it can't run, it's scrap. Simple economics." He stopped in front of a massive shape covered by a canvas tarp. The canvas was so thick with grime, it had turned the color of charcoal, stiff and unyielding. It looked less like a covered car and more like a sleeping prehistoric beast. Sterling tapped the object with the toe of his shoe. The dull thud sounded disrespectful in the cavernous space. "Take this thing, for example," Sterling said, sneering. "My grandfather hoarded junk like this. Probably hasn't seen the light of day since the 70s. It's taking up valuable square footage." He turned to his foreman, a burly man standing by a bulldozer outside the bay doors. "Hey, Miller, get the crusher ready. We're going to flatten this lump of iron live on stream. Let's show the world what we do to the past when it gets in the way of profit." In the shadows behind the camera crew, a movement caught the light. It was a boy, or perhaps a young man, though his hunger-hollowed cheeks made him look younger than his 19 years. He was on his knees, scrubbing a patch of oil from the floor with a rag that was blacker than the stain. He wore a mechanic's jumpsuit that was 3 sizes too big. The sleeves rolled up to reveal forearms scarred by burns and scrapes. This was Caleb. Caleb didn't look up at the cameras. He didn't look at the billionaire. His eyes were fixed on the covered machine that Sterling had just kicked. To Sterling, the factory was a graveyard. But to Caleb, it was a cathedral. He had spent the last 2 years hiding in these walls, working as an off-the-books janitor, breathing in the metallic air as if it were oxygen. He couldn't speak. His voice had been stolen years ago in the fire that took everything else from him. But he could hear things others couldn't. He heard the settling of the foundation, the groan of metal expanding in the heat, the whisper of air moving through old vents. When Sterling kicked the machine, Caleb flinched. It wasn't a flinch of fear. It was a physical reaction, as if Sterling had kicked Caleb's own ribs. Caleb stood up. He moved silently, his oversized work boots making no sound on the grease-stained floor. He wasn't supposed to be seen. He was a ghost in the machine, a rat in the walls. But the thought of that crusher closing its jaws around what lay beneath that tarp triggered a protective instinct so fierce it drowned out his survival mechanism. Sterling was busy laughing at a comment on his live stream feed when he felt a presence. The air seemed to shift, growing colder. He turned around and found himself staring directly into a pair of eyes that burned with a frightening intensity. Caleb stood just outside the circle of the ring light. He was dirty, smelling of solvent and sweat, a stark contrast to Sterling's cologne and cashmere. But he didn't lower his gaze. He stared at the billionaire, then shifted his eyes to the covered machine, and then back to Sterling. The look was heavy, accusing, and profoundly sad. "Excuse me?" Sterling laughed nervously, unsettled by the boy's silence. "Can I help you? The janitorial staff is supposed to clear out before we go live." Caleb didn't move. He took a single step forward, placing his body between the billionaire and the machine. It was a small, defiant boundary line drawn in the dust. Sterling's smile faltered. The camera was still rolling. The comments were flying by on the screen, people asking who the dirty kid was, why the billionaire looked rattled. Sterling's ego, fragile and inflated as a balloon, couldn't handle the silent challenge. He felt the sudden, hot prickle of irritation. This nobody, this piece of industrial waste, was interrupting his show. "Oh, I see," Sterling said, his voice dropping an octave, becoming dangerous. "You think this junk is worth saving. Is that it, kid?" Caleb nodded once. A sharp, singular motion. Sterling looked at the camera, a cruel idea forming behind his eyes. He saw a way to turn this interruption into entertainment. He saw a way to prove his point, that the old world was weak and money was the only king. "Well then," Sterling said, turning fully toward Caleb, a predatory grin spreading across his face. "Let's make this interesting." Sterling didn't wait for an answer. He moved with the theatrical swiftness of a talk show host, stepping across the boundary line Caleb had drawn. He threw a heavy arm around the boy's shoulders, pulling him forcibly into the frame of the camera. The contrast was jarring. The navy Italian wool against the grease-stained, oversized canvas of Caleb's jumpsuit. Sterling smelled of sandalwood and money. Caleb smelled of old iron and sweat. "Get a close-up on this," Sterling commanded, flashing his teeth at the lens. "We have a volunteer, a local preservationist, apparently." The comment section on the screen behind them was scrolling so fast it was a blur of neon text. Sterling fed off it. He tightened his grip on Caleb's shoulder, his fingers digging into the thin muscle beneath the fabric. He treated the boy not as a human being, but as a prop, a convenient foil to highlight his own brilliance. "So here's the deal, kid," Sterling said, his voice dropping to a conspiratorial volume that the microphone picked up perfectly. You think this pile of scrap has a soul? You think it deserves to take up space in my new world? Prove it. He gestured to the vast, empty expanse of the factory floor, to the deed of ownership that symbolically hung in the air. I'm feeling generous today. If you can make this thing run, and I mean really run, not just sputter and die like the rest of this city, I'll give you the deed to this lot. All of it. The land, the scrap, the rust. It's worth $100 million, give or take. A gasp went through the small crowd of production crew and construction workers. Even the cameraman wavered. It was an insane offer, the kind only a man with infinite resources and zero fear of losing could make. But, Sterling continued, his eyes hardening into flint, when you fail, because let's be honest, you're going to fail, you owe me something. He pointed down at his shoes. They were handcrafted leather, polished to a mirror's shine that reflected the factory lights. You get down on your knees, right here in front of 3 million people, and you lick the oil off my boots. You admit that the past is dead, and you're just the janitor who sweeps up the ashes. The cruelty of the wager hung in the stagnant air. It wasn't about the shoes. It was about submission. It was the new world demanding the old world kneel. Caleb stood frozen. His heart hammered against his ribs, a frantic bird trapped in a cage. He looked at the boots, then at the covered machine. Suddenly, a commotion broke out near the bay doors. A man burst through the line of security guards, limping but moving with a desperate, angry energy. Don't listen to him, kid. It's a fix. It was Iron Mike. The old foreman looked like he had been carved out of the factory itself. Weather-beaten, gray, and hard. He wore a faded union cap, and his left hand was missing the pinky finger, a sacrifice to the assembly line decades ago. He scrambled over the cables, ignoring the shouts of the production assistants, and grabbed Caleb by the arm. Walk away, son, Mike hissed, his voice a gravelly ruin of concern. He glared at Sterling with hatred that had been marinating for years. He knows it won't start. That thing under the tarp, it's a husk. They gutted the internals back in '74 to sell the parts. There's no engine block, no pistons, nothing. It's a steel coffin. He's just trying to humiliate you. Sterling rolled his eyes, checking his watch. Security, remove Grandpa, please. He's ruining the vibe. It's hollow, Caleb, Mike pleaded, shaking the boy's arm. Don't give him the satisfaction. Let's just go. Caleb looked at Mike. He saw the fear in the old man's eyes, the fear of a man who had been beaten down by men like Sterling his whole life, who had learned that the only way to survive was to keep your head down and your mouth shut. But Caleb couldn't leave. He felt a pull, a magnetic tether connecting his chest to the cold metal beneath the tarp. It wasn't logic. It wasn't hope. It was something primal. Since he was a child, since the fire took his voice, machines had spoken to him in a language of vibrations and heat. And right now, the thing under the tarp wasn't silent. It was whispering. Faint, weak, like a pulse buried under miles of rock. But it was there. It wants to wake up. It's waiting. Gently, Caleb peeled Mike's fingers off his arm. He looked the old man in the eye and shook his head slowly. I have to try. Mike slumped, the fight draining out of him. He stepped back, his face crumbling into a mask of preemptive grief. You're a fool, kid, he whispered. A brave damn fool. Caleb turned back to Sterling. The billionaire checked his manicure, looking bored. Caleb reached into the deep breast pocket of his jumpsuit. His hand emerged holding a screwdriver. It was ancient, the handle made of yellowed wood, worn smooth by decades of sweat. The steel shaft dark with age. Carved into the handle was a faint, almost invisible letter S. He held the tool up like a knight drawing a sword. He looked at Sterling and nodded. Sterling clapped his hands together, the sound sharp and violent like a gunshot. Fantastic. We have a deal. He spun toward the camera, his showman mask slipping back into place. Put 15 minutes on the clock. The countdown to the end of an era starts now. A digital timer appeared on the giant monitor behind them, red numbers glowing ominously. 15 hask. Caleb didn't look at the clock. He turned his back on the billionaire, on the cameras, on the skepticism of the world. He stepped toward the tarp, his grip on the old screwdriver tightening until his knuckles turned white. He was walking into a graveyard to raise the dead, and he had 15 minutes to do it. The red digital numbers on the wall ticked down, 14:59, 14:58, eating away the seconds with ruthless precision. To everyone else in the room, that clock was a threat. To Caleb, it didn't exist. He reached up and grabbed the corner of the heavy canvas tarp. With a slow, deliberate pull, he dragged it backward. The fabric rasped against the floor, kicking up a cloud of dust that smelled of ancient decay. The tarp fell away, pooling like a dead skin around the base of the machine. What was revealed drew a collective groan of disappointment from the onlookers. It was hideous. It wasn't the sleek, retro beauty people expected from a classic car find. It was a monstrosity of raw industrial design, a hulking chassis of oxidized steel, pitted and scarred like the surface of the moon. There were no headlights, just empty sockets staring blindly ahead. The paint had long since peeled away, leaving behind a patchwork of rust and primer. It looked less like a vehicle and more like a partially digested meal of some mechanical beast. Jesus, Sterling muttered, covering his nose with his silk handkerchief. It's worse than I thought. It's a carcass. Caleb didn't hear him. The moment the metal was exposed, the world around him, the jeering construction workers, the blinding camera lights, the hum of the drone hovering overhead, began to dissolve. The noise of the present receded, replaced by a profound, hollow silence. He stepped closer. He didn't pop the hood immediately. He didn't reach for a wrench. Instead, he laid his cheek against the cold, rough fender. He closed his eyes. To the audience watching the live stream, he looked insane. A dirty kid hugging a pile of junk. The comment section exploded with ridicule. But Caleb wasn't hugging it. He was listening. Thump. It was faint, a vibration so subtle it might have been his own pulse echoing back at him. But it was there. A resonance. The metal wasn't dead. It was dormant. It was holding its breath. Inside his mind, Caleb saw the machine not as a solid object, but as a complex nervous system. He could visualize the fuel lines like veins, the pistons like sleeping muscles. He remembered the nights he had spent sneaking into this section of the factory, reading the faded blueprints he'd found in the trash, tracing the logic of a man he never knew but somehow understood perfectly. His eyes snapped open. The ghost hands took over. That was what Iron Mike had called them once, watching Caleb fix a forklift that had been broken for a decade. You don't work like a mechanic, kid. You work like a medium at a seance. Caleb moved. The lethargy was gone, replaced by a fluid, rhythmic urgency. He jammed the wooden-handled screwdriver into a seam near the intake manifold. He wasn't loosening bolts. He was adjusting the tension. He moved to the carburetor, his fingers dancing over the adjustment screws with the lightness of a pianist. He wasn't forcing the metal. He was negotiating with it. Off to the side, leaning against a stack of pallets, Sarah, Sterling's executive assistant, frowned at her tablet. While her boss was busy preening for the camera, she had been running a background check on their volunteer. She swiped through the database, expecting to find a criminal record, a home address, parents, something. But the screen kept blinking, a single frustrating result. No record found. "Who are you?" she whispered to herself. She dug deeper, accessing the factory's old payroll archives, the ones Sterling hadn't bothered to digitize yet. She found a single entry from a local orphanage, a waiver signed 3 years ago allowing a ward of the state to apprentice at a nearby garage. No name given, just a placeholder. Doe, John. Status, mute. Note, survivor of the 2005 Midtown fire. Sarah looked up from the screen, her eyes locking on Caleb's back. The Midtown fire. That was the blaze that burned down the old tenement buildings near the river. The fire where the city's forgotten people lived. The fire that nobody investigated because the land was more valuable, empty. A sudden, wet sound from the machine snapped her attention back to the present. Caleb had twisted a valve near the bottom of the block. Immediately, a thick, black sludge began to ooze out onto the concrete. It was viscous and foul-smelling, pooling around Caleb's boots like congealed blood. "Oh, look at that!" Sterling shouted, gesturing dramatically at the mess. "He's killed it. It's bleeding out, folks. That's the oil pan giving up the ghost. I told you, it's a coffin." The crew laughed. Even Iron Mike looked away, wincing. To a normal mechanic, black sludge leaking from a block usually meant a cracked seal or a catastrophic failure. It looked like death. But Caleb didn't panic. He stared at the black pool spreading across the floor. Slowly, incredibly, the corners of his mouth lifted. He smiled. It was a small, private smile, but it transformed his face. The oil wasn't a sign of death. It was the old, coagulated lubricant finally moving, pushed out by the pressure he had just reintroduced to the system. The blockage was clearing. The veins were opening. The monster wasn't bleeding out. It was clearing its throat. Caleb wiped his hands on his jumpsuit, leaving dark streaks across his chest. He looked at the timer. 09 to 30. He had cleared the airway. Now, he had to make the heartbeat. He turned back to the engine, his eyes blazing with a terrifying focus. The surgery was just beginning. 5 minutes. That was all that remained of the world. The digital clock on the wall had become a red, blinking eye, watching the execution. 05 West. 04:59. Caleb was no longer moving with the frantic energy of a mechanic. He was moving with the terrifying stillness of a bomb disposal expert. He had stripped the ignition wiring, pulling out the rotted rubber cables that looked like dead veins. To the untrained eye, and to the millions watching on their phones, it looked like vandalism. He was bypassing the factory standard ignition entirely, twisting copper wires together in a complex braided pattern that defied every manual ever written for a combustion engine. Sterling watched from the edge of the safety line, his arms crossed. The amusement was beginning to drain from his face, replaced by a dull, itching anxiety. The boy was too focused. There was no hesitation in his hands, no trembling. He wasn't acting like a kid guessing a combination. He was acting like a musician playing a song he had memorized before he was born. He's bypassing the solenoid. Iron Mike whispered from the sidelines, his voice thick with disbelief. He's hot-wiring the heart directly to the brain. You can't do that. The pressure will blow the valves. Sterling didn't know what a solenoid was, but he knew what confidence looked like. And he didn't like seeing it on a janitor. He caught the eye of his head of security, a man named Graves, who was built like a vending machine and possessed about as much empathy. Sterling made a small, almost imperceptible motion with his chin. Just a twitch. Disrupt him. Graves understood. He shifted his weight, feigning a yawn, and took a heavy step forward, ostensibly to check the perimeter. As he passed Caleb's workstation, his foot lashed out, a clumsy stumble that was as calculated as a sniper's shot. The toe of his boot slammed into Caleb's open metal toolbox. The crash was catastrophic. Tools scattered across the concrete like shrapnel. Wrenches skidded under the tables, washers rolled into the darkness. But the real casualty was small. A single brass screw, the main pressure valve regulator, bounced off the rim of the box. It hit the floor with a high-pitched ping, rolled in a perfect mocking arc, and slipped through the narrow slats of a storm drain grate. Plop! The sound of the metal hitting the stagnant water deep below echoed in the sudden silence. "Oops," Graves grunted, not even looking down. "My bad. Tight quarters in here." Sterling covered a smirk with his hand. "Clumsy, clumsy. Hope you didn't need that, kid. Clock's ticking." Caleb froze. He looked at the empty spot on the floor, then at the dark throat of the drain. Iron Mike groaned, turning away. That's it. That was the pressure valve. Without it, the fuel won't compress. It's over. For the first time, Caleb stopped. His hands, which had been steady as stone, began to shake. The panic didn't hit him like a wave. It hit him like smoke. It filled his lungs, choking him. He opened his mouth to scream, to curse, to demand they get a magnet. But nothing came out. Just a dry, broken rasp. Suddenly, he wasn't in the factory anymore. He was 6 years old, trapped in the hallway of a burning tenement building in Midtown. The smoke was black and oily, tasting of melting plastic. He was screaming for his father, screaming until his vocal cords tore and blistered in the heat, but no one came. The silence of his own voice in that inferno was the most terrifying sound he had ever heard. He was back there now, helpless, mute, watching something precious die because he couldn't make a sound to save it. 3 minutes, Sterling announced, his voice booming with renewed cheer. Better start puckering up, kid. My boots are getting dusty. The laughter of the crew felt like physical blows. Caleb sank to his knees. The darkness of the drain seemed to be pulling him in. He had failed. He was just a mute boy with a box of scattered tools, fighting a billionaire god. Then the cold metal against his chest burned. It was a sharp, sudden heat against his skin. Caleb gasped, his hand flying to his throat. Underneath his greasy jumpsuit, hidden from the world, hung a necklace. It wasn't jewelry. It was a piece of scrap metal on a shoelace. A jagged, triangular shard of titanium that the firefighters had found clutched in his unconscious hand the night of the fire. They had given it to him in the hospital, thinking it was a toy. Caleb had never taken it off. He gripped the shard. It felt heavy. It felt right. A realization hit him with the force of a physical blow. He looked at the shape of the shard in his hand. Then he looked at the empty hole in the engine block where the pressure valve used to be. The shape, the unique hexagonal tapping of the hole. The triangular flange needed to seal it. It couldn't be. The odds were impossible. But Caleb didn't care about odds. He cared about the vibration. With trembling fingers, he ripped the shoelace from his neck. He held the jagged piece of metal up to the light. It wasn't just a piece of scrap. It was a component. A custom-forged titanium valve seal, broken off from something larger, something that had exploded years ago. He leaned into the engine. "What's he doing?" Sarah whispered, stepping closer, her tablet forgotten. Caleb pressed the shard into the open valve hole. It didn't just fit. It snapped into place with a definitive, airtight click that felt like a key turning in a lock. It wasn't a spare part. It was the original part. The piece he had carried next to his heart for 13 years wasn't a souvenir from the fire that killed his father. It was the missing piece of his father's work. Caleb stared at the connection, tears cutting clean tracks through the grease on his face. He wasn't fixing a car anymore. He was putting a family back together. He grabbed a wrench and tightened the seal. The tremble in his hands was gone. The fear was gone. He looked up at the clock. It was 45. He looked at Sterling. The billionaire wasn't smiling anymore. He was staring at the engine, a look of primal confusion on his face, like a man watching a statue start to bleed. Caleb stood up. He didn't need the remaining 45 seconds. He reached for the ignition wires. It was time to wake the giant. The countdown clock didn't just reach 0. It felt like it collided with the end of the world. 3, 2, 1, Sterling shouted, his voice cracking with premature triumph. He opened his arms wide, soaking in the attention of the camera, ready to deliver the punchline he had been rehearsing in his head. "Time's up, Cinderella. On your knees. My boots aren't going to clean themselves." His sentence was severed by a sound that wasn't mechanical. It was atmospheric. Caleb hadn't turned a key. There was no key. Instead, he had taken the 2 stripped ignition wires, the red positive and the black negative, and he didn't just touch them together. He tapped them. Tap, 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 tap. It was a rhythm, a code, a heartbeat. For a microsecond, the factory was silent, save for the electrical crackle of the spark jumping between Caleb's fingers. Then, the air inside the warehouse seemed to implode. The explosion that followed didn't come from the exhaust pipe. It came from the very soul of the machine. It was a low seismic frequency that hit the chest before it hit the ears. The concrete floor, thick enough to support tanks, vibrated so violently that the camera tripod danced a few inches to the left. Sterling didn't just stop talking. He fell. The sudden concussive force knocked him backward, his expensive Italian loafers slipping on the very oil he had mocked moments ago. He landed hard on his tailbone, his mouth hanging open, his eyes wide and uncomprehending. A massive plume of black smoke erupted from the rear of the machine, thick and solid as a thunderhead. It shot 20 feet into the air, instantly blinding the drone hovering above. But then, as the pistons found their rhythm, the smoke cleared. It turned from black to a translucent, shimmering heat haze. And then came the roar. It wasn't the sputter of an old engine. It was a harmonious, terrifying scream of 12 cylinders firing in perfect, impossible unison. It sounded like a choir of lions. The noise was so loud it didn't just fill the space, it erased everything else. The construction crew covered their ears. The glass panes in the skylights 60 feet above began to rattle in their frames, dusting the floor below with decades of accumulated grime. But the most miraculous thing wasn't the sound. It was the sight. The machine was shaking. It was vibrating with such intense power that the surface layer of corrosion, the thick, brown scab of rust that had covered it for half a century, began to crack. Like a snake shedding its skin, flakes of rust the size of dinner plates popped off the bodywork. They rained down onto the concrete, clattering like hail. Underneath the rot, something gleamed. A shaft of sunlight from the rattling skylight hit the fender. It wasn't gray steel. It was blue. A deep, impossible, endless blue. Midnight blue. The kind of color that looked black until the light hit it. and then it looked like the ocean floor. Caleb stood in the center of the storm, his hands still holding the wires together, his body vibrating in sync with the car. He wasn't smiling anymore. He was weeping. He looked like a conductor leading an orchestra through the apocalypse. Iron Mike, who had been shielding his eyes from the dust, lowered his hands. He stared at the emerging color, at the long, sweeping lines of the chassis, now revealing themselves as the rust fell away. His face went pale, drained of blood. He recognized the sound. He recognized the color. He fell to his knees, not in defeat, but in worship. "It can't be," Mike whispered. Though no one could hear him over the roar, he mouthed the words, his lips trembling. "The Phantom." Sterling scrambled backward, crab walking away from the beast on his hands and feet, his suit ruined, his dignity shredded. He looked at the machine with genuine terror. This wasn't a car. It was a judgment. The thing he had tried to crush, the thing he had laughed at, was now screaming at him with a voice that sounded dangerously like his own grandfather. The V12 engine settled into an idle, a low, menacing thrum that sounded like a heavy heartbeat. Thum, 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 thum. Caleb slowly pulled the wires apart. The roar died instantly, leaving a ringing silence that was louder than the noise had been. The machine sat there, partially stripped of its rust, gleaming in patches of dark blue, breathing heat and the smell of high-octane gasoline. It was alive, and the entire world was watching. The silence that followed the engine's roar was heavy, pressing down on the factory floor like a physical weight. The dust motes that had been shaken loose by the vibration drifted in the shafts of sunlight, settling on the shoulders of men who had forgotten how to breathe. Sterling was the first to move. He scrambled to his feet, frantically brushing the dirt from his ruined suit. His face was a mask of flushed, erratic anger. The fear he had felt moments ago was already hardening into something uglier. Denial. "Cut the feed!" Sterling screamed at the cameraman, his voice cracking. "Turn that damn thing off! Security! Get this kid away from the machinery before he blows us all up." Two guards stepped forward, their hands reaching for their batons. They looked uncertain, glancing between the fuming billionaire and the vibrating, living miracle of metal in the center of the room. "Don't touch it." The voice didn't come from Caleb. It came from Sarah. Sterling's executive assistant, a woman who usually blended into the background like office furniture, stepped into the light. She held her tablet like a shield, her knuckles white. She walked past the guards, past her boss, and went straight to the machine. "Sarah, what are you doing?" Sterling snapped, wiping sweat from his forehead. "I said shut it down. We're scrubbing the live stream. This never happened." "You can't scrub it, Marcus," Sarah said, her voice trembling but loud. 3 million people just watch this, and you can't touch this car. Not legally. She reached out, not to the engine, but to the firewall, right where the rust had flaked away to reveal the midnight blue steel. She used the sleeve of her blazer to wipe away a layer of grime from a small, rectangular plate riveted to the chassis. It wasn't aluminum. It was gold. "Look at the VIN," she whispered, the words amplified by the sudden quiet of the room. Sterling stomped over, peering over her shoulder. "I don't care about the vehicle identification number. It's scrap metal." "It's not a number," Sarah corrected him. "It's a deed." Sterling squinted. Etched into the gold plate wasn't a standard string of digits. It was a sentence engraved in the elegant, unmistakable handwriting of his grandfather, the founder of the company. "To the one who wakes the giant. The machine is the key. The patent lies within." "The lost patents," Sarah said, looking up at Sterling, her eyes wide with shock. The rumors were true. Your grandfather didn't lose the rights to the V12 technology. He didn't let them expire. He etched the original schematics microscopically onto the chassis of this car. He hid the company's soul inside the one prototype he knew you and your father would never touch, because you were too busy looking at stock prices. She turned to the camera, which was still rolling despite Sterling's orders. This isn't just a car, Marcus. This chassis is the controlling interest of Sterling Automotive. And you... She paused, looking at the stunned billionaire. You just betted against a shoe shine. Sterling staggered back as if he'd been punched. The color drained from his face, leaving him looking gray and aged. He looked at the car, the junk he had tried to crush, and realized he was looking at his own termination notice. But Iron Mike wasn't looking at the car. He was looking at the boy. The old foreman walked slowly toward Caleb. His eyes were locked on the boy's chest, where the grease-stained jumpsuit was open at the collar. That piece, Mike said, his voice rough with emotion. He pointed a trembling finger at the titanium shard that Caleb had used to seal the pressure valve. The valve key? Where did you get that? Caleb didn't answer. He couldn't. He simply placed his hand over his heart, over the spot where the metal had hung for 13 years. Mike stepped closer, invading Caleb's personal space. He looked at the boy's face, really looked at him, stripping away the grime, the scars, the years of poverty. He looked at the shape of the jaw, the intensity of the eyes. A memory hit the old man, sharp and painful. A memory of a brilliant engineer named David. A man who loved machines more than money, who had died in a suspicious tenement fire in Midtown just days after refusing to sell his designs to Sterling's father. David, who had a young son, a son who loved to sit in the shop and listen to the engines hum. David never let that key out of his sight, Mike whispered, tears spilling into the deep wrinkles of his cheeks. He wore it around his neck. He said it was the only key that could start the Phantom. He said he was saving it for his boy. Mike reached out and touched Caleb's shoulder. It was a gentle, reverent touch. You're him, Mike choked out. You're the little boy from the shop. You're the one who survived the fire. The revelation rippled through the room. The construction workers lowered their tools. The security guards stepped back. Caleb didn't pull away. He looked at Mike and gave a small, sad nod. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a folded, charred photograph. He unfolded it with delicate care. It showed a younger Mike standing next to a laughing man in a lab coat, Caleb's father, both of them leaning against this very car, back when it was new and gleaming. Mike covered his mouth to stifle a sob. He turned to Sterling, his grief transforming into a righteous fury. You didn't just bet against a janitor, Marcus, Mike growled. You bet against the rightful heir. This boy's father built this empire's heart, and your family burned him down for it. Sterling looked from the golden VIN plate to the silent boy. The magnitude of his mistake was crashing down on him. He hadn't just lost a bet. He had unearthed a ghost story that was about to consume him. He opened his mouth to speak, to call his lawyers, to spin a lie, but no words came. The roar of the engine had stopped, but the echo of it was still tearing his world apart. Caleb stood tall. He wasn't the ghost in the machine anymore. He was the owner. The silence in the factory was no longer empty. It was heavy with judgment. This is ridiculous, Sterling stammered, his voice rising to a frantic pitch that echoed thinly against the steel rafters. He looked around at the faces of his employees, the security guards, the camera crew. He was searching for an ally, for someone to share in the absurdity of the moment. But he found only cold stares. You can't be serious. It was a figure of speech, a joke. I didn't actually bet the deed to the property. That's not legally binding. He pulled his phone from his pocket, his thumbs shaking as he dialed his chief counsel. I'm calling legal. We're going to have this whole site locked down. Nobody leaves, especially not him. He pointed a trembling finger at Caleb. Caleb didn't flinch. He didn't look at the billionaire. He reached into the open engine bay and disconnected the wires. The V12 engine died. The vibration stopped. The great beast went back to sleep, but the presence of it remained, dominating the room. Caleb walked around to the front of the car. The hood was still thick with 50 years of gray dust, except for the places where his hands had rested. He looked at Sterling, who was now screaming into his phone, demanding injunctions and restraining orders. With a slow, deliberate movement, Caleb extended his index finger. He began to write in the dust on the hood of the Phantom. The scratching sound of his finger against the grime was soft. Yet it seemed to carry further than Sterling's shouting. Iron Mike stepped closer to read it. Sarah leaned in. The cameraman, sensing the finality of the moment, zoomed in tight, projecting the words onto the massive screen behind them for the whole world to see. Keep the dirt. I take the heart. Caleb wiped his hand on his jumpsuit. He walked to the driver's side door. It groaned as he pulled it open, a sound of heavy, solid metal that they didn't make anymore. He slid into the driver's seat. The leather was cracked and dry, but it held him like a father's embrace. Stop him! Sterling shrieked, dropping his phone. Graves, stop him. He's stealing company property. Graves, the head of security, looked at his boss. He looked at the ruined suit, the desperate eyes, the hollow arrogance. Then he looked at Caleb, sitting behind the wheel of a machine that was clearly part of his own soul. Graves slowly reached up and unclipped his radio from his belt. He placed it on a nearby crate. Then he folded his arms and stepped aside. I don't see any theft, Mr. Sterling. Graves rumbled deep in his chest. I see a man collecting his winnings. Sterling stood paralyzed, betrayed by the very authority he thought he had purchased. Caleb reached under the dash and touched the wires again. This time, the engine didn't roar. It purred. It was a smooth, confident sound, ready to move. He shifted the gear lever, a long chrome stick that rose from the floorboard. It clicked into first gear with mechanical precision. The car began to move. It rolled forward, crushing the debris on the floor, pushing aside the barriers of the safety zone. As Caleb drove toward the massive bay doors where the sunlight was pouring in, a strange thing happened. The workers, the men Sterling had fired, the men he had called dinosaurs and scrap, began to form a line. They didn't cheer. This wasn't a football game. It was a funeral procession for the old world and a coronation for the new king. They stood in 2 rows, creating an aisle for the car to pass. As the blue fender glided by, they reached out. Rough, calloused hands, hands missing fingers, hands stained with oil, hands that had built this city, gently touched the hood, the roof, the trunk. They were blessing it. They were saying goodbye. Iron Mike stood at the very end of the line, tears streaming freely down his face now. As the car passed him, he didn't touch it. He simply straightened his back, removed his faded union cap, and held it over his heart. A salute to the boy who had no voice, but who had spoken louder than any of them. Caleb looked at Mike through the dusty windshield and nodded. A promise kept. The Phantom rolled out into the blinding afternoon sun, the midnight blue paint igniting into brilliance. It turned onto the broken asphalt of the access road. the engine opening up as it found the straightaway, the sound fading into a distant, beautiful thunder. Back inside the dark factory, the dust began to settle again. Sterling stood alone in the center of the vast, empty floor. The camera crew was packing up. Sarah had already walked away, her resignation letter sent from her tablet moments ago. The workers were leaving. Sterling looked down at his feet. His Italian leather shoes were ruined, stained black with oil. He looked at the empty space where the car had been, a clean, rectangular patch of concrete surrounded by dirt. He had kept his land. He had his millions. He had his data center plans. But as he stood there in the silence, listening to the wind whistle through the broken windows, Marcus Sterling realized the terrifying truth. He was the poorest man in the building. Money can buy silence, folks, and it can certainly buy a lot of land. But as Marcus Sterling found out standing in that empty factory, it can never buy respect. I want to hear from you down in the comments. Be honest with me. If you were in Caleb's worn-out boots, staring at a life-changing fortune or your father's legacy, would you have taken the $100 million? Or would you have taken the car? Let me know what you think real wealth looks like. If this story revved your engine and reminded you that character still counts for something in this world, do me a favor. Hit that like button. It helps us get these stories to the people who need to hear them. And don't go anywhere. I've got another story waiting for you right here on the screen. About a man who thought he could buy forgiveness until a stranger showed him the receipt. Click right here. I'll see you in the next one.